Hello and welcome to your 2025 April edition hurricane season forecast. First of all, I'm going to show you our current sea surface temperature anomalies, and we are talking about mostly above average temperatures, but this is nothing like we saw last year. In fact, we have a well below average main development region, which is a stark contrast from March of last year, which we had a record-breaking amount right out here. And we also have some warmer temperatures over here, which we did not have in the hurricane season last year. We actually had generally below average temperatures. And that is looking generally below average up in this area, which is because we're going to probably see we're seeing more storm tracks at the moment over that region. And here's something different. Here is sea surface temperature 7-day change. And this is going to be like, did it get cooler over the last 7 days or warmer over the last 7 days? And so far, it looks like it actually got cooler in most regions, especially out here in the main development region, except right here, which it did get somewhat warmer. And we do have a cooling down Caribbean as well. But it looks like most of our Gulf is actually warming up, as well as over here, at least in the past week. But over the last couple of months, we have seen a big decrease in our overall sea surface temperature anomaly over the whole North Atlantic. We went from almost a degree above average to now only about a fifth a degree above average, which is the area we want to be in. This is just record breaking, and we had that for like a year and a half. So this is nice that we're finally seeing a nice decline in our sea surface anomalies. And I think that will still continue for a little bit. So here's our next parameter. This is our CFS model, and this is our future prediction for moisture anomaly, which can often predict if we're going to have drier air over the Atlantic than normal or wetter air over the Atlantic than normal. Last year, these models were predicting like really, really high amounts. And that is still what they're predicting for May 2025, at least with this model. But as we head into June, it gets more average. And in July, we have this big area of below average precipitation and a small band of above, which makes me think that we're going to see a enhanced chance for activity over here in July based on this model. And we're likely going to see more storms just kind of recurve like that during this month, according to this model again. But a big difference here is we have well below average in general, below average Gulf, below average Caribbean, and we do have a small area of above average wave jet here. But again, we have this below average area, which is going to be a stark contrast from this, and it is going to rule a lot of our pattern. And as well here, we also have a area out here as well, which seems like it's going to be above average. But as we move into September, it seems like we're going to get mainly near average out here, below average maybe on the East Coast, and the Caribbean and Gulf still seem below average. And it looks like a potentially very, very inactive October, except we might have a lot of moisture out here. And November looks to be slightly more active, but this is again too late for storms to really form up here in November. But something to watch out for. If this does actually come into play, we could have something spin up and get kind of close to the Caribbean there. And that finishes off the year of 2025 into January of 2026. Now, here's another model run. I'm going to warn you, this one is a lot different from the rest of our models. As you can see here, it shows a very, very active Caribbean and jet out here, but it also does show below average activity in general over the East Coast here. Meaning that we could probably see still like a lot of storms here, but a lot of these storms just kind of recurve and stay out of our way. But it could also produce a active Caribbean, which is very, very different from what the CFS has been showing. This is our can sips. And lastly, this is our third model run. This is like a blend of models ensemble here. Not NBE or NBM, but this is NMME. This is a pretty accurate one that we like to look at for our forecasts. Probably one of our most accurate, honestly. And this one is definitely predicting a well below average season as we head into August, especially down here. But again, we do have this northern area that seems like it will be above average, which makes me think that we're going to see a lot more northern waves this year and not as much southerly. Kind of like what we saw last year, which could actually produce less if the dust does take over like it did last year. And again, it rules in September. You can see kind of a recurving look to this, and way inactive Caribbean, which I definitely agree with this too. And just like the CFS, we're seeing above average activity in October and November in these upper areas here, and below average activity further south, where the main development usually happens. Our next thing that we're going to look at is our ENSO forecast, which changes a lot of our patterns here. And right now we are in a neutral, which means we're kind of in between, and it's really hard to forecast what's actually going to happen this year because of that. And it is spring. So the warm waters here in the Central Pacific would be El Nino, and that usually causes a above average season over here in the Pacific and a below average season over in the Atlantic, because there's a thing called wind shear, which just tears off the upper clouds of these thunderstorms that develop over here, and it plays a big factor in it. And right now it seems like we are definitely in a neutral. We are El Nino further east, La Nina further west, which is definitely an interesting pattern. And the forecast with our NMME shows it kind of moving into a more general solution here. And then La Nina pops out near the end of the season. But this is a stark contrast from our other models. Here's our can sips again. And it is predicting still a neutral season. And then as we head early next year, potentially El Nino. But this is definitely way too far out. This is like March of next year. Like that, yeah, that's way too far out at this point. And our CFS, my second favorite model, is showing more of an El Nino-ish kind of a pattern, which could produce a less active area out here. And here is our change from La Nina here, and we entered neutral, and officially we're on the warmer end of the neutral as we headed toward mid-March here. And then we have dipped closer back to La Nina in the last couple of weeks. And this is like our average sea surface temperatures compared to the rest of the waters. Again, we do seem to have a well below average waters out here, well below average here. But otherwise, the Atlantic is still pretty warm across here. Now, this is something that we like to look at. This is ocean heat content equivalent. This is a little different than what other people often put out. But this is still a good indicator of what might happen. We are predicting a hyperactive season last year, and this is all the way up here into the Gulf, above the Caribbean on a 7th of April of last year. But this year, our ocean heat content is decently cooler. Still not cool, but it is a little less worrisome than it was last year. Although our loop current up here in the Gulf is still above what it was last year. But this could still bring some pretty big storms, because it is still warmer than normal out here. And this, based on our current sea surface temperature anomalies in the world right now, in the Atlantic here, and over here in the Pacific, This is 2012, and this is an analog year, which means this is kind of following similar temperature patterns. And this is the top analog of them. And you can see here that we had a lot of activity out here and not as much activity over here as well. We only had one storm actually form in the Caribbean, and that was Sandy, and that was October, because in this area that is usually when these kind of storms usually form. Also, we had this in the west, and we had plenty of storms actually traverse it, like Ernesto and Isaac. But in general, it was a below average intensity season, and we had a lot of storms just out to sea. Here's our second top anomaly, and we seem to have a decently active Gulf and Caribbean, but we also are active out here, which is interesting. And it shows a lot less activity out in here in the main development region, except for this tropical storm here and a bunch of depressions over here. But in general, we are seeing most of our activity more in the Caribbean and the Gulf as compared with 2012. But still, we're not seeing intense storms hit the U.S., which is a sign to look out for with our top two analogs. But this one is our third analog. This is 2017. And in this season, we had three very, very significant storms. We had Harvey over here in Texas that just stalled. We had Irma that traversed the Caribbean. Jose that kind of just went right behind it. But our really bad one for the Caribbean down here is Maria, which ended up becoming a very, very powerful Category 5, very similarly to Irma. And it was just very active out here, which is a lot different than what we've been seeing. We still do have activity over here, smaller activity in the Gulf, but this year we had two major landfalls as compared to none in either of the other two. And this year is 2001, and it is very obvious that our activity is very much out here and in the Caribbean a little bit, and less along the U.S. coast here, which is very interesting because it is the third out of four of our top anomalies here that is showing this kind of a pattern, where we have a lot of storms just kind of hanging out here, and fewer storms over here moving into the Gulf. We only had tropical storm landfalls during this year, which is extremely rare. And we had recurving storms like Aaron over here, Felix here, but we also did have some powerful Caribbean storms too. Now, this is a similar year, kind of like 2017, where we had a lot of tropical activity out here in the open Atlantic, and we had powerful storms like Brett over here to Texas, major landfall, and powerful Floyd, which overtook the East Coast really hard as a powerful Category 2, but this storm was a high-end Category 4 originally. But we did have two recurving storms as well. And then a sort of anomalous one. It kind of had a weird pattern going with it. We had a powerful Category 4 Lenny. And this is actually our most intense November storm until 2020. And then it was taken over by Iota. But this was also a very significant storm. So overall, a very destructive year. And with these, they put together a frequency based on these tracks. And actually, in the Pacific, it is looking pretty simple, where we have above average activity over here in the eastern portion, and maybe below average in the rest of it, and maybe a slight area where we could have above average activity over here. But it is very strong as well, because we're not seeing like a bunch of streaks like we are over here in the Atlantic. But in general, the Atlantic during this looks like it's favoring a bunch of storms out here, and potentially eastern Gulf, and a lot of the Gulf Coast, and southern Caribbean. And kind of like what our precipitation models were showing, below average further south, but above average further north, which I think we are definitely going to see this come to fruition right here, where we definitely have more of a northern path and less likely a barrel path. And this is our NMME analog years. This is 2013, a year with no majors, and the only one in the 21st century like that. And it was very inactive, very active out here, but inactive over here. And again, we're having below average activity to the US, where we only have one landfalling storm here. And it does kind of line up with a lot of our analogs from earlier. But I would say this is probably our most accurate analog year because it is the forecast for it, for our temperatures. Here's our second analog year for that, and it is actually quite active, especially in the Western Caribbean and Gulf, which is a lot different from our other analogs. But again, it seems like we don't have a lot of strong ones though, but it is showing a lot of storms going out in here, and a decent amount out here as well. Like we have a powerful category 2 that just stays out to sea, just to the west of the Azores. This is 1967, and this one is very much so active over here on near the East Coast, well below average in the Gulf and Caribbean in general, except for Boila, something like that. And that storm just kind of traversed both basins there. But most of our activity ended up being either out here or up in here this year. This is the 2000 hurricane season, very similar to the 2001. There was no hurricane landfalls during this year. And we had multiple recurving storms. Alberto and Isaac are the major ones here, the major players. But we also did have powerful Keith here in the Western Caribbean, which was slightly anomalous, being as we did not have as many other storms in this part of the basin this year. And it was mostly a bunch of storms just dying out over here, and a couple storms forming right over here, and a decent amount of small Gulf systems. And lastly, this is 2011, a very, very active year, but luckily with this, our only really impactful storm was Irene, which took a path that tore through the Caribbean, right over eastern portions of Puerto Rico, just to the north of our island of Hispaniola right here, and right through the Turks and Caicos and Bahamas before it paralleled the east coast all the way up to the northeast in Canada. But other than that, we had two very powerful recurving storms and another one that was just a bunch of other storms that were just recurving. And our third major was Rena over here in a late season, which ended up being powerful but small and ended up not making a bunch of damage. And based on that, here are those analog storm tracks. It's showing well above average activity right here, formation at the coast of Africa. But a lot of these storms do not track west, and more of them just kind of go north and out, although this is a greater influence from Isaac and Alberto in 2000. Otherwise, it would not be there. Also, we are seeing a more below average Caribbean and a central area. The northeastern corner is active and a western portion here. Also, it is predicting a active southwest Gulf. But strongly in contrast with the other one, we're seeing below average coastal landfalls with these analogs. And more of the storms just kind of hanging out here, which is again above average, and some storms that just kind of die out here and just recurve, which I think is going to be a common phenomenon, but we're still going to see powerful storms in here for sure. And here's a comparison with that other one, which is definitely more active. Again, there's the predicted one, and here's based on the forecast. Now, the current temperatures, which is definitely showing more active and cross-Caribbean kind of a season. And that leads us to my hurricane season forecast, which is forecasting a slightly above average season. Our normal is 14 named storms, 7 hurricanes, and 3 major hurricanes. But in more recent years, we usually have 15 or 16 storms in general. And again, I would still say we're predicting a slightly above average season. But since 1995, we are definitely have more storms than this in general than the 1473 is what I mean. But anyway, that's all I have for you. Thank you so much for watching this video. And I'll see you in my other normal weather forecasts. And potentially another hurricane season forecast if this changes significantly. See you guys later.